Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings for Week 2 of the 2024 fantasy football season. The schedule is pretty simple over the course of today's episode. I'm going to begin by talking about matchups and identifying the most advantageous or perhaps the most disadvantageous matchups going into this upcoming week, after which I'll transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions while also presenting statistics in order to justify these players' overall rankings. If you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, of course, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Subscribe, click the like button down below if you haven't yet already, because we're making daily fantasy football content for the remainder of the season, and also be live streaming every day for the remainder of the season. I'll be live streaming later tonight if you have any questions regarding starter sits or perhaps the wide receiver rankings that will be presented on screen in the coming moments. Okay, let's go ahead and begin by talking about wide receiver statistics allowed in regards to receiving statistics isolated. Based on Week 1 overall production, the Washington Commanders are still at the top of this conversation. At the end of the 2023 season, the Washington Commanders allowed the most fantasy points per game in terms of receiving statistics to wide receivers. So the expectation is that if in fact the secondary is going to continue to play poorly, there's a reason why Malik Nabers is the thumbnail of today's episode. And as we progress, you'll begin to see, based on where I have him ranked, why I value him so highly. But the Detroit Lions were also in this conversation last season, giving up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers. Now, as we progress and get more data regarding, defenses and secondaries going up against wide receivers, we'll get a better understanding as to which are the most advantageous or most disadvantageous matchups going into the remainder of the season. But as it currently stands, these are the statistics. Do with them as you will. I will refer back to these over the course of today's video, but just wanted to go ahead and show you guys the results of Week 1. Okay, let's get into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings. Beginning with our number 1, Tyreek Hill, who plays on Thursday Night Football. Yes, it's a short week, and based on Vegas's overall total, this is expected to be the second highest scoring game of the week. Taking on the Buffalo Bills is typically a competitive matchup between these two teams. Obviously, the Buffalo Bills have had the advantage over the course of the last couple matchups, but in Week 18 of the 2023 season, when Tyreek Hill took on the Buffalo Bills, 13 targets, 7 receptions, 82 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 17.7 fantasy points. In a negative game script list last week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, was able to lead the team with 130 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, and 22.5 fantasy points. We're expecting that level of production once again this week, and with all of the running back injuries that the Miami Dolphins are dealing with, it may be a passing funnel to Tyreek Hill in Thursday night's matchup. Moving on to our number 2, we have Cooper Kupp, another automatic start in the absence of Puka Nacua. Cooper Kupp is coming off a performance of 21 total targets, 14 receptions, over 100 receiving yards, and a touchdown. 21 targets is 9th most all-time amongst all players in a singular game. That is a ridiculous number. Cooper Kupp continues to break records, and now that he's healthy and with a healthy Matthew Stafford, the expectation is taking on the Arizona Cardinals should be a breeze. Last season, in 2023, from weeks 1 through 4, in the absence of Cooper Kupp, when Puka Nacua was the primary number 1, he was averaging 13 targets per game. But the difference is that Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford have a greater rapport. And because of this, we're going to expect even more targets on our per game average in the absence of Puka Nacua. Number 3, we have CeeDee Lamb. Again, another one of these automatic starts to close out the S tier. Even though he only played 71% of the offensive snaps and he hadn't gone ahead and participated in training camp because he was waiting for, his contract obviously secured a massive bag, he still was able to get himself 10 targets within his first game back. Only 5 receptions for 61 receiving yards, but it was a difficult matchup taking on the secondary of the Cleveland Browns. This week, they take on the New Orleans Saints. We are already hearing that Marshawn Lattimore, the primary number 1 cornerback of the New Orleans Saints, is dealing with a hamstring injury and could in fact miss this game. If in fact that takes place, CeeDee Lamb, who's coming off of 8 consecutive 10-plus target games, should be in line for a lot of opportunity and a lot of fantasy success. Now, for those of you who are trying to take advantage of the potential of CeeDee Lamb this week, you can do so via Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you head on over to Underdog Fantasy, you can take advantage of the 0.5 total yards play of CeeDee Lamb. Now, for those of you who want to get my all-encompassing rankings sent from my email directly to yours every single Sunday for the remainder of the season, all you got to do is check out the link down in the description, sign up using code Andrew, and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. When you do so, you'll be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, take advantage of the CeeDee Lamb play, and of course, get my rankings by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings at every position, including flex. All you got to do is, again, use code Andrew, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, and make sure you're eligible based on the map to the right side of the screen. If you're not eligible based on your current location, or if perhaps you've signed up with a code in the past, you can also get my rankings via Patreon. The link is down in the description. All of that content and much more available there. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. Okay, let's get into talking about the beginning of the A tier. We have A.J. Brown, another one of these auto-start wide receivers that really we have no issue with. He's coming off of a massive week against the Green Bay Packers, and even though he was taking on someone like Jair Alexander, was still able to find himself 5 receptions on 10 targets, which is the the beauty of the overall game. The fact that he was getting himself a lot of opportunity is all that matters. 5 receptions for 119 and a receiving touchdown. Obviously made a big play after the catch. Was able to get himself over 20 fantasy points. Beautiful. Takes on the Atlanta Falcons. You go from Jair Alexander to now getting mainly covered by AJ Terrell this upcoming week. I really don't have an issue with it as long as the target share is going to be 29 to 30%. The cornerback matchup is an afterthought based on the elite level of play that AJ Brown produces every single week. Number 5, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. I understand Amon-Ra St. Brown's overall performance of 3 receptions for 13 yards and 2.8 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format is underwhelming. But this week he takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and based on Vegas's overall total, this is expected to be the highest scoring game of the week. And on top of that, the Detroit Lions are major favorites. I think they're minus 6-point favorites. The last 2 times that Amon-Ra took on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense was last season, once in the regular season and once in the NFL playoffs. In the regular season, week 6, 15 targets, 12 receptions, 124 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown, 24.5 fantasy points. In the playoff game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 14 targets, 8 catches, 77 yards, and a touchdown, 17.7 fantasy points. I'm expecting a huge bounce back performance here from Amon-Ra St. Brown. Number 6, we have Deebo Samuel. In the absence of Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel as a rushing threat is going to have himself a lot of value. 8 rushing attempts for 23 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown is really what's going to continue to unlock his potential. Now, this is again under the assumption that we do not have Christian McCaffrey participating in this game, which could very easily be the case because they don't need Christian McCaffrey to beat the Minnesota Vikings this week. So if they give him another week off, Deebo Samuel will continue to be asked to get himself utilization within the running game. Additionally, had himself 9 targets for 5 catches and 54 receiving yards. He's a machine within the yards after the catch category. So all you got to do is get him the ball, and he's going to have any given play turn into a touchdown. So my expectation going into this week, I understand that the matchup against the Minnesota Vikings secondary is a difficult one, but Brandin Aiyuk will primarily be pulling the coverage of Stephon Gilmore. Deebo Samuel will be able to avoid that and find himself a lot of opportunity within this game. On number 7, we have Justin Jefferson. Speaking of the Minnesota Vikings matchup, Justin Jefferson on the other side of this overall conversation should see himself far more opportunities. 6 targets is not enough. I understand in terms of the overall target share, he had himself 25% within the offense, but of a player of the caliber of Justin Jefferson, we're expecting more. And considering Jordan Addison is once again dealing with an ankle injury, the expectation is that Jordan Addison may in fact miss this game, and if that's going to take place, all of the targets should be going in the direction of Justin Jefferson this week. He played 84% of the snaps, and I understand that they were up for majority of this game, at a pretty big rate, considering, of course, the New York Giants could not keep it competitive, so they, defaulted to having to run the ball in the second half and seeing less opportunities for someone like Justin Jefferson. But going forward, in a matchup in which he is the primary number 1 and really nobody else is stepping up, should see himself a lot of opportunity and hopefully a lot of fantasy success. To continue on with the A tier, we have our number 8, Ja'Marr Chase. Ja'Marr Chase, in a week in which we didn't even know if he was going to play at a full capacity, obviously late in the week popped up on the injury report in regards to, not only being limited in Wednesday and Thursday practice, but on Friday and Saturday popped up in terms of an illness. So we didn't even know what to expect, but we knew that if in fact Ja'Marr Chase was going to play, we wanted him in our lineup. Still got himself 6 receptions on 6 targets for 62 receiving yards. The biggest concern for Ja'Marr Chase is, of course, he hasn't had a full workload of training camp to get him in full game shape. But despite that, still was able to score 9.2 fantasy points. The biggest issue as of Ja'Marr Chase right now really isn't his overall conditioning. It's Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow only completed 3 passes of 10 or more yards down the field in Sunday's game against the New England Patriots. And there's a reason why the New England Patriots dog-walked the Cincinnati Bengals. Going into this week, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, without T. Higgins most likely in the lineup, we're probably going to have to see Ja'Marr Chase garner double-digit targets if this offense wants to be competitive. Joe Burrow is going to have to step up in order to get Ja'Marr Chase far more integration within the offense. Our final of the A tier is Mike Evans. Again, another one of these stud plays that every single week will ball out. And even if he doesn't ball out, you can expect the following week a huge bounce-back performance. Obviously, to begin the season, 2 receiving touchdowns on 5 receptions, 61 receiving yards. Pretty much the perfect Mike Evans scoreline that you would typically expect. Now, when we talk about touchdowns for Mike Evans, if we just look at 2024 thus far and 2023 with Baker Mayfield, in the last 21 healthy games, he has scored 15 total touchdowns. That is a ridiculous number, and it's only going to continue to improve, especially this upcoming week, taking on the Detroit Lions. The last time he took on the Lions in the NFL playoffs last year, 12 targets, 8 catches, a $147 and a receiving touchdown for 24.7 fantasy points. We're expecting a big week here for the wide receivers of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. On number 10, we have Rashee Rice. That is right. Rashee Rice is back in the top 12 conversation. We had him in this top 12 conversation late last season, but now that we go ahead and once again see that he is the preferred number 1 target of Patrick Mahomes going forward, we have more confidence in starting Rashee Rice. I want to go ahead and just put this out there. Since week 12 of the 2023 season, in the games in which, of course, Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce have both played together, Rashee Rice has out-targeted Travis Kelce 98-81. He is clearing away the number one, and they take on the Cincinnati Bengals, who again start very slow. They haven't won a game in week 1 or 2 since 2021. Therefore, we're expecting a huge performance here out of Rashee Rice, who's coming off a performance of 7 catches for 103. The last time he took on the Cincinnati Bengals in week 17 of last season. 5 catches for 127, over 15 fantasy points. We're hoping for similar numbers. Number 11, we have Garrett Wilson. Even though Garrett Wilson was able to get a little bit extra value late in that game because of the overall efforts of Tyrod Taylor in that final drive. But in the final drive with Aaron Rodgers, he had back-to-back targets and unfortunately wasn't able to convert them. One was considered out of bounds, even though he technically got his second foot down. And then eventually that toe went out. I don't know. The refs are changing the rules every week, it seems like. But either way, when we talk about the potential of Garrett Wilson going forward, Aaron Rodgers did end up saying after the game that he wants to see more looks for Garrett Wilson as we progress. As they continue to build a rapport, it's going to continue to look better and better as time goes along. I know that this week they have a difficult matchup taking on the Tennessee secondary. Their defense played extremely well last week, and with L'Jarius Sneed being the number one cornerback, it definitely makes it a little bit more difficult for the upside of Garrett Wilson. That being said, he does have a lot of potential considering the quarterback that he's associated with, and if he can continue to get double-digit targets, he's eventually going to find himself within the end zone. I do want to mention, of course, last week I did end up having a pick'em slip via Underdog Fantasy that contained Garrett Wilson. It barely clipped over because of the efforts of Tyrod Taylor, was able to win big. Again, I will go ahead and I will release more information regarding my next pick'em play this upcoming Friday in the Hidden Gems episode. So for those of you who are interested in potentially following, be sure to swing on by for that episode. Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to our number 12. We have Nico Collins. Nico Collins, again, coming off a huge week. 6 receptions, $117. 4 of the last 5 games have consisted of Nico Collins surpassing 85 plus total yards. So as long as he's going to continue to get this kind of high volume of opportunity, still be the number one wide receiver in terms of being the X on the outside, and the Houston Texans offense are going to continue to score at this kind of a volume, the expectation is that Nico Collins should maintain as a number one wide receiver and a top 12 at that. Now, obviously, this upcoming week against the Chicago Bears has a very difficult matchup taking on Jalen Johnson, one of the best cornerbacks in terms of coverage in the National Football League. We'll have to wait and see how that progresses. But if, in fact, the Bears offense does not show up and Caleb Williams is not able to put together decent drives, this could very easily turn into a blowout in the favor of the Houston Texans offense. Number 13, we have Jaylen Waddle taking on the Buffalo Bills on Thursday Night Football. Obviously, Jaylen Waddle's coming off a great week, 13.7 fantasy points and a half PPR, 109 receiving yards, 5 receptions, but only 5 targets. That is not enough target opportunity for a player at the level of Jaylen Waddle. But like I mentioned before, in the case of Tyreek Hill, if in fact we're going to continue to see the running backs of the Miami Dolphins continue to be designated out, we know that Raheem Mostert isn't going to play Thursday. If Devon Achane is going to be in a limited nature, there may be even more opportunity for the receiving work of guys like Jaylen Waddle and Tyreek Hill to step up, because they will probably be in a negative game script for majority of that contest against the Buffalo Bills, as the Buffalo Bills have had their way with the Miami Dolphins defense in the last couple matchups that they've took each other on. Number 14, we have Davante Adams. I have a lot of trust in Davante Adams. He's extremely talented, and yes, he's getting up there in age, and he doesn't have the greatest quarterback in Gardner Minshew. And what we have seen from the Raiders organization, once Antonio Pierce took over in 2023, and of course he is still the head coach of this team, any game in which Davante Adams shows up and doesn't get a proper volume of opportunity, the following game, there's always a bounce back. Specifically in 2023, in weeks 9, 12, and 16, Adams had 7 or fewer targets in each of those 3 games. In week 10, in week 13, and in week 17, he was able to total 13, 10, and 21 targets. I'm expecting a huge bounce back game in a negative game script taking on the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens, again, are 9.5-point favorites. They're going to have to throw the ball a lot within the Las Vegas Raiders offense in order to even be competitive. Davante Adams should see himself a lot of opportunity within this game. Number 15, we have the thumbnail of today's episode. We have Malik Nabers taking on the Washington Commanders defense and secondary that has struggled all of last season and once again this season. Benjamin St-Juste is the primary number 1 cornerback. Last season, amongst all cornerbacks, he allowed the 10th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. Again, obviously couldn't find himself any success trying to cover someone like Mike Evans. Chris Godwin had his way. Even the McMillan, the rookie wide receiver, found himself scoring a touchdown within this overall contest last week. The Washington Commanders secondary is in trouble. And even with Malik Nabers only having the efforts of Daniel Jones throwing him the ball, the expectation is that he should be able to put together a solid performance and pretty much put a stamp on the defining performance of the rest of his season with a big fantasy contribution. Again, he played 100% of the offensive snaps last week. If that continues to maintain, he'll get himself a lot of opportunity in this game. Number 16, we have DeVonta Smith. Like we mentioned in the offseason, DeVonta Smith was going to pretty much play in the role of Keenan Allen and CeeDee Lamb because of Kellen Moore's overall integration within those offenses as the former offensive coordinator of the 2023 Chargers and, of course, 2019 to 2022 Dallas Cowboys. In this game against the Green Bay Packers in Week 1, played 71% of his overall snaps within the slot position. If he's going to continue to dominate within the slot receiving role, played 100% of the offensive snaps, and additionally had himself over 45 yards after the catch. As long as he's going to maintain this role, the expectation is that DeVonta Smith, at a base minimum, will be a top 20 wide receiver every single week with the upside of a touchdown. Moving on to our number 17, we have Brandin Aiyuk. I understand that Brandin Aiyuk in Week 1 did not perform well, but nobody expected him to perform well. Primarily because, again, he didn't participate in any of training camp, and the San Francisco 49ers coaching staff specifically said that they were going to keep him limited. He only played 60% of the offensive snaps, but very easily could have still scored a touchdown. Unfortunately, dropped the touchdown to the back end of the end zone. If in fact he ends up making that play, he makes his entire fantasy week and no one is panicking. Understand that, again, he is going to have to ramp up in the coming weeks considering he did not participate in training camp. Neither did guys like CeeDee Lamb and, of course, Jamar Chase. They're ramping up, but they are far better talents in comparison to someone like, Brandin Aiyuk, who, again, over the course of the entirety of last season, even though he was great for fantasy purposes, only averages somewhere between 6 to 7 targets per game. So he's not going to be given that much opportunity and that much more of an expansive role in comparison to Monday night's performance with only 5 targets. Okay, moving on to our number 18, we have Chris Godwin. Like I mentioned earlier, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receivers should find themselves a lot of success. And considering Chris Godwin has been moved back to the slot receiving role, and we have a new offensive coordinator in the form of Liam Cohen, again, someone that is a former offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams, it is putting Chris Godwin in a Cooper Kupp-esque role. 8 targets, 8 receptions, 83 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown against the Washington Commanders. Should be able to take advantage of the matchup against the Detroit Lions. Most recently, the Rams just took on this defense. Cooper Kupp dominated. But if you go ahead and just look at the slot receiving statistics of Rams wide receivers against the Detroit Lions on Sunday Night Football's game, 19 targets, 14 receptions, $123 and a touchdown. Liam Cohen, very familiar with Sean McVay, is if he's able to exploit the same things that Sean McVay did, Chris Godwin should have himself a fantastic week, a must start. Number 19, we have Chris Olave. I know that many of you are disappointed with his overall performance in Week 1. 2 targets, 2 receptions, 11 receiving yards. But understand that when you're up 30-0, there's no necessity to throw the ball to your wide receivers, especially in the form of Chris Olave. But this matchup against the Dallas Cowboys this week is going to be far different. They're not going to be able to take an immediate lead. And of course, they're not going to be able to blow out the defense and bring in their, backup running backs to kill the clock. So in this overall contest, it is going to be a difficult matchup taking on, Diggs as the primary coverage corner. But in my opinion, Chris Olave should be in a far better position in terms of negative game script and see far more targets because of that in this overall circumstance. Again, we're firing him up. We drafted him to be one of our studs. We got to give him a chance. Number 20, we have Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs played 64% of his overall snaps within the slot position, which is very promising. Again, this is exactly what the offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick, said this offseason in regards to getting Stefon Diggs. They asked him, how do you want to use him? He said, I want him to be a slot receiving threat, make plays after the catch. And that's exactly what he did. Now, even though his overall yardage and his ADOT weren't the greatest, 6 receptions leading to 33 yards, but 2 touchdowns saved his overall week. There are going to be games in which he doesn't score those touchdowns and it's going to hurt him. But going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Chicago Bears, I think the matchup specifically against their nickel corner, Kyler Gordon, does favor Diggs. And the fact that Diggs had 2 of the 3 total red zone targets within this offense definitely does help him. And in the most recent update in terms of injuries, we know that Dalton Schultz did end up missing practice earlier today. So if in fact that affects him and he does end up missing the game, could lead to more opportunities for Stefon Diggs over the middle of the field. Number 21, we have Michael Pittman Jr. The Packers defense is, again, pretty solid. Jair Alexander, they've got pretty decent cornerbacks. But the question is, can the Packers offense sustain to be able to keep drives alive, to keep the ball out of the hands of the Indianapolis Colts, which I don't believe that to be the case. I think Malik Willis is going to sink this team. Now, I'd be more than happy to be proven wrong because that'll elevate the value of guys like Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Josh Jacobs, etc. But as it currently stands, I'm expecting this to be a one-sided affair, and that is going to lead to the upside of Colts receivers. Now, Colts receivers in last week's contest, with only 9 passing completions from Anthony Richardson, were only able to find real success with huge plays down the field. But of the 9 completions, 4 of them went in the direction of Michael Pittman Jr. He led the team in terms of 8 total targets, and as long as he's going to continue to maintain as the number 1 receiving option, he's still going to have immense value going forward. Number 22, we have Drake London. Again, another one of these wide receivers that put up a lackluster performance. 3 targets, 2 receptions, 15 receiving yards. The Eagles secondary has still struggled. Again, they gave up a bunch of points to the Green Bay Packers wide receiver force. But if, in fact, Isaiah Rodgers does end up returning this week, which he did not play last week, Isaiah Rodgers hasn't played football since 2022, but he is a great coverage corner. This could end up potentially impacting the overall upside of Drake London. But if we don't see Isaiah Rodgers out there, and if it's going to be Darius Slay once again, Drake London, who literally played 100% of the offensive snaps, should be in line for far more targets. The only way to do so is, again, keeping Kirk Cousins healthy and clean. They weren't able to do so last week. TJ Watt annihilated this offensive line. If the Eagles defensive line gets after, Kirk Cousins, could be another upsetting week for many fantasy managers. Moving on to our number 23, we have DJ Moore. Look, DJ Moore, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 36 yards, not the greatest week, but if Caleb Williams can continue to improve, it's only going to help DJ Moore's overall upside based on the injuries that have taken place within this offense. Keenan Allen's dealing with an injury. Rome Odunze is dealing with an injury. It seems more that Rome Odunze is likely to miss in comparison to Keenan Allen, but nonetheless, injuries are going to now funnel majority of the targets in the direction of 1 or 2 receivers. And if it's going to go to a main receiver, not named Keenan Allen, it will go in the direction of DJ Moore, who has an opportunity this week taking on the Houston Texans to make plays deep down the field. With the Indianapolis Colts finding so much success deep down the field, the expectation is that DJ Moore should be integrated in a manner in which they're giving him those kind of level of opportunities. Now, as to whether or not Caleb Williams improves in week 2, time will tell. Moving on to our number 24, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. The biggest concern I have for Marvin Harrison Jr. is that, again, yes, he is a rookie. The matchup this week should not be difficult. I mean, the Los Angeles Rams secondary has played well, specifically in week 1, but I mean, they still gave up a pretty big chunk of yardage and statistics to someone like Jameson Williams, even though Amon-Ra St. was a non-factor. This being said, the biggest concern that I have is the statements and comments that Kyler Murray made earlier today. When he was asked about giving more opportunities to Marvin Harrison Jr. going forward, he said the following: "It's not my job." So he basically alluded to, sometimes he's going to get the ball, sometimes he's not, and that's not my job. That's the job of the offensive coordinator. The offensive coordinator tells me not to worry about these things and let the ball go where it goes. If Kyler Murray, the starting quarterback of the Arizona Cardinals, isn't at the podium saying, yeah, I need to give Marvin Harrison more targets, that concerns me. Because why wouldn't you say that? That's the proper thing to say instead of, no, that's not my job. What do you mean it's not your job? Your job is literally to throw the ball to your best receivers in order to find success. I don't know. Those kind of comments just rub me the wrong way. I think going forward, hopefully Marvin Harrison is going to be an immediate impact player within this upcoming matchup. Again, it's one of the higher scoring expected matchups based on Vegas. As long as Marvin Harrison finds himself open, the ball will go in his direction. I understand he had a tough matchup in week 1. These comments from Kyler Murray do not help the overall situation and the concern, but going forward, I do trust that he could still be a top 24 wide receiver in this given week. Number 25, we have Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers had himself a lot of opportunity in week 1. 12 total opportunities, 8 total touches. But this upcoming week, he takes on the Raiders. Again, they are 9.5-point favorites. He's going to have to make do with as many of the opportunities he gets, and he's going to have to make as much overall upside with those opportunities because there's not going to be a high abundance of them. Because they're going to maintain a very early lead, and once they do so, they're going to run the ball down the Las Vegas Raiders defense throat until the clock expires. So let's hope that Zay Flowers is able to get himself enough opportunity early to get the yardage and get a potential touchdown to save his overall week. Number 26, we have DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf, again, wasn't really a factor within week 1's overall matchup because they wanted to run the ball and they effectively did so. Outside of that, Patrick Surtain was definitely a difficult matchup for DK Metcalf. But going into this week, we have Christian Gonzalez, who is another one of these difficult matchups in terms of cornerbacks. Last season, or even earlier this year, basically in week 1 against Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase only had 3 receptions and 15 receiving yards in coverage against someone like Christian Gonzalez. But he's also shut down guys like Garrett Wilson for 3 catches for 18, Tyreek Hill for 0 receptions and 0 yards within their overall matchups. The last time they took each other on, DeVonta Smith only had 2 receptions for 22. Christian Gonzalez is not to be messed around with. He's a pretty good cornerback. Obviously, in his second year, obviously dealt with a season-ending injury last year, but nonetheless, if DK Metcalf isn't going to be given abundance of opportunity, and Tyler Lockett's going to continue to be the number 1 somehow, some way, and it's going to be difficult coverage, number 26 seems fair. Number 27, we have Xavier Worthy. We did get a little bit of information earlier today that Marquise Hollywood-Brown did not end up practicing. If, in fact, he's going to miss once again, it only elevates the value of Xavier Worthy, someone who was able to get himself opportunities on the ground and through the air and was able to score in both of those overall scenarios. A rushing attempt for 21 yards and a touchdown. Many of us all saw that in the debut game of the 2024 NFL season. But he's going to have volatile performances. If he doesn't score touchdowns, you got to remember last week he had 4 opportunities, 3 touches, and 2 touchdowns. Scoring on 66% of your overall touches is not a common thing in the National Football League, but considering you're associated with one of the best offenses in the league and to take on a Cincinnati Bengals defense that was in shambles, there's a potential in which Xavier Worthy at number 27 is a pretty safe play. Number 28, we have Keenan Allen. Like I mentioned earlier, he's dealing with an injury himself, but he was also last week, ended up playing nonetheless, getting himself 11 targets. Now, Rome Odunze is more likely to potentially miss this upcoming week based on his injury. So if Keenan Allen's out there against the Houston Texans, I'd like to fire him up. He's coming off a week in which he had technically 11 total targets, but only 5 of them were deemed catchable. That is concerning, but if the opportunity is going to be there for Keenan Allen, and of course there's only one of two places for Caleb Williams to go with the ball, either DJ Moore or Keenan Allen, I'm expecting this offense to have to throw for the majority of this game, and especially in the second half, in order to keep up with the Houston Texans offense. Number 29, we have Amari Cooper. Taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars is going to be a far easier matchup in comparison to what they had to deal with taking on the Dallas Cowboys pass rush and secondary. Amari Cooper is coming off a week in which he was number 1 amongst all wide receivers in terms of total air yards, 9 total targets, only 2 receptions for 16 receiving yards. He's honestly at the mercy of Deshaun Watson, and if Deshaun Watson continues to play like an absolute mess, we're in trouble. But again, the ease of the overall matchup should lead to far more opportunity for Amari Cooper. Played 95% of the offensive snaps, did have valuable opportunities in terms of 9 total targets, but if in fact Deshaun Watson can at least clean up his game a little bit, it'll help Amari Cooper's overall upside. Number 29, pretty safe spot. Number 30, we have Tank Dell. Tank Dell played 63% of the offensive snaps, but played the majority of his overall workload from the outside. That's exactly where he lined up last season. 63%, as long as we can get him to maybe 65+% of the overall offensive snaps, that's where we want him to be at, especially that's where he was finding a lot of success last season in games in which he was playing 65 or more percent of the offensive snaps. He's getting a pretty good volume of air yards. He's able to get himself a pretty good volume of the overall snap share, and he's still playing on the outside, which will allow him to make plays deep down the field. So going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, when Jalen Johnson is, of course, worried about Nico Collins and Kyler Gordon is trying to deal with Stefon Diggs, I think Tank Dell could have himself a major week here and, of course, have himself an upside performance. Number 31, we have Terry McLaurin, who's coming off a poor performance of 2 receptions for 17 receiving yards. But this week, they take on the New York Giants. Again, the New York Giants cornerbacks are not great. They struggled all of last year and once again this season thus far. So the expectation is that Terry McLaurin should have himself a great overall performance, assuming, of course, Jaden Daniels looks in his direction more often than potential 4 targets within a singular game. Now, the history of Terry McLaurin taking on his division rival in the New York Giants is storied. I've talked about this for multiple seasons, and anytime he has a matchup against the Giants, I bring this up. In 8 of the last 9 games that Terry McLaurin has taken on the New York Giants, he has had 70 or more receiving yards. In half of those games, has scored a touchdown. He's typically taking advantage of the matchup. Hopefully, Jaden Daniels looks in his direction this week. Number 32, we have Brandin Cooks. Brandin Cooks, again, I mentioned this in the waiver wire episode earlier this week. In games in which he's been given opportunity, it's going to lead to success. And considering there is going to be a lack of Jake Ferguson dealing with his knee injury, we should see more opportunity for Brandin Cooks within this offense. As a member of the Dallas Cowboys over the course of the last 2 seasons, in games in which he's been given 7 or more targets, averaging 13.17 fantasy points per game, has been able to accomplish that in 6 different games. So again, with opportunity comes success, taking on the New Orleans Saints secondary that could be missing a couple of their starting corners. We have Courtland Sutton as our number 33. Courtland Sutton, again, getting 12 targets, beautiful. But only 5 of them were deemed catchable. Very similar to the numbers in which, of course, Keenan Allen experienced in week 1. But if Bo Nix and this offense are going to have to throw the ball for the entirety of games for the remainder of the season, and his number 1 favorite target is Courtland Sutton, fantastic, even though he is going to be pulling better coverage, and it's going to allow for other receiving options to find themselves, a role like Josh Reynolds had or Vele had, where they're getting themselves 8 targets and being able to at least find more success within those opportunities. Eventually, with Bo Nix improving over the weeks, he will find himself success. And as we know, it's always within the realm of possibility that Courtland Sutton can come out of a week with a touchdown. He scored 10 of them last season. All right, moving on to our number 34, we have George Pickens. George Pickens, again, only twice last season, had himself 6 or more receptions within a singular game. Was able to already accomplish that in week 1's contest. 6 receptions for 85 receiving yards against the Atlanta Falcons and AJ Terrell. So if in fact we're going to be in a position in which, of course, Justin Fields starts again this week, which is all signs are pointing in that direction, if they're going to continue to build a rapport, and of course the opportunities are going to continue to go in George Pickens' direction, even though he does have difficult matchup against Patrick Surtain II, I would expect George Pickens to still have himself opportunity to be a top 36 wide receiver within the given week. Number 35, we have Jameson Williams. If JMO is going to continue to get more opportunities within this offense, and it's going to dig into the work of Laporta or Amon-Ra St. Brown, and he's going to continue to build a kind of rapport and confidence with Jared Goff, quite frankly, Jameson Williams needs to be in this top 35 conversation. Now, he has the ability to make a singular play turn into a touchdown, whether it's on the ground or through the air. He has shown that over the course of the last 2 seasons of his career. But as long as the opportunities continue to be there, that's all that matters in this circumstance, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary, who, even though they weren't exposed in week 1, when we look back at 2023, they definitely struggled over the course of that season. Number 36, we have Brian Thomas Jr. And number 37, we have Christian Kirk. I wanted to mention both of the Jacksonville Jaguars wide receivers back-to-back. Brian Thomas Jr. is the one that I'm starting over Christian Kirk. Not because he scored a touchdown in week 1, but because he's playing more offensive snaps and saw just as many targets. And considering Christian Kirk always has the possibility of losing out on snaps because of personnel, if they go into far more 12 personnel sets, Evan Ingram would be implied to be that slot receiving role option within the offense. I believe that Brian Thomas Jr. has the capabilities of putting together another great performance of potentially 10 plus fantasy points. I'm just hoping that Christian Kirk can follow and do the same. Number 38, we have Demarcus Robinson. Like I mentioned in the video in terms of waiver wire pickups earlier this week, when we talk about Demarcus Robinson in 2023 from weeks 13 through 17 as a starting wide receiver of this offense, averaging 13.34 fantasy points per game. In 4 of those 5 games as a starter, was able to score a touchdown and was able to get himself 6.8 targets per game. Coming off of a week in which he had 7 targets, he'll continue to maintain as a starting role within this offense in the absence of Puka Nacua, but we do expect him to get far more potential for a touchdown upside in Puka Nacua's absence as well. Number 39, we have Ladd McConkey. As long as this rapport continues to build with Justin Herbert, we know that Justin Herbert wants to typically complete passes, close to the line of scrimmage and not at a great ADOT. So as long as we're going to have Ladd McConkey continuing to cook here in the absence of Keenan Allen, he could continue to be one of Justin Herbert's favorite targets. Taking on the Carolina Panthers this week could get ugly very fast and could lead to a lot of points for all of the receivers of the Los Angeles Chargers offense. Number 40, the final player I wanted to mention is Calvin Ridley. We know that DeAndre Hopkins should be returning to a greater role this week, but they do take on the New York Jets. That in itself is very dangerous if Sauce Gardner's at a full capacity and Calvin Ridley is still having to deal with the poor performance of Will Levis. Unfortunately, regardless of how many targets you're going to potentially get and how many snaps you're going to play, if they're not accurate targets, if they're not deemed catchable, quite frankly, it's nothing that Calvin Ridley can do at that point. It's a difficult matchup, and that's why we have him all the way down here at number 40. All right, that's going to cover it in terms of my top 40 wide receiver rankings for week 2 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to click the like button. Again, if you guys haven't yet already, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. If you guys are trying to take advantage of the Thursday night overall free pick, be sure to sign up today using code Andrew. Make that first time deposit minimum of $10. Not only will you be able to take advantage of this overall free pick and play, but you'll get my rankings sent to you from my email directly to yours for the remainder of the season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until tomorrow, where we'll be talking about quarterback and tight end rankings, thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.